Just like the NFL, fantasy football has a history of not liking players who underperformed or disappointed in previous seasons. So I have found 3 players who I believe are in make or break seasons, giving a history of underperformance or disappointment in the past, but also have some pretty solid upside as well in the future if certain things go their way. So let's get right into the video. So the very first player that I believe is entering a make or break season into 2021 is actually Cincinnati Bengals running back Joe Mixon. And I mean, there is a lot of fatigue with Joe Mixon entering this year. I mean, this is probably the 4th year that we've been going into where we've been hyping up and projecting Joe Mixon to have some sort of a massive breakout. So that kind of stuff can get really tiring. But surprisingly enough, Joe Mixon has actually been a good fantasy player over the past 3 seasons. I mean, he was the RB10 in 2018, the RB13 in 2019. He only played 6 games though last year, but in those 6 games, he was the RB10 overall in points per game with almost 17, which was right behind Jonathan Taylor and Nick Chubb and ahead of Austin Eckler. But there are negatives with Joe Mixon, right? I mean, number one, he hasn't been the most reliable asset when he is on the field and when he is playing on a weekly basis. Yes, like I said, he averaged 17 fantasy points per game last year, but in 5 of those 6 games, he actually scored fewer than 15.5 fantasy points, including 2 games under 10 fantasy points. I mean, look at his 2020 game log at the start of the year. He had a pretty rough stretch for the first few games. Week 1, he had 20 touches for 70 yards for 8.1 fantasy points. Week 2, 20 touches for 85 yards for 12.6 fantasy points. Week 3, 19 touches for 65 yards, 8.5 fantasy points. Then week 4, 31 touches for 181 yards and 3 touchdowns, 42.1 fantasy points. But then right after that, weeks 5 and 6, he went right back to the mediocrity that he was at the beginning of the year and then just got injured and didn't play for the rest of the season again. So I went back and I really wanted to dive into this boom bust play for Joe Mixon on a weekly basis. And I actually found that among players with 25 or more games played over the last 3 years, Mixon is 4th worst in percentage of games outside the top 24, behind David Montgomery, Miles Sanders, and Marlon Mack. I also found though that Mixon is 9th among those same running backs over the last 3 years in percentage of top 12 RB1 games with 41%, which is right behind Derrick Henry. So that is extremely frustrating from a player that you drafted as potentially your RB1 or at least your RB2 over the last couple of seasons, when you're basically flipping a coin on whether or not you're going to get an RB1 top 12 asset or a flex play at best type asset on a weekly basis. But there are positives for Mixon entering the 2021 season. Last year, Mixon was on pace for almost basically record highs in every category. He was on pace for over 300 carries, 1,150 yards, and 8 touchdowns. And then also was on pace for 70 targets, 56 receptions, 370 yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns through the air. So he was well on his way to over 350 plus touches on the season, which is a stat that only Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry were able to do last year, and no other running backs actually had over 310 total touches in 2020. And then also Giovanni Bernard was cut. He was signed by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, so he's gone, and he has never had fewer than 30 receptions in every season with Joe Mixon since Mixon entered the league in 2017. So that's a very similar argument to why we're really excited about Aaron Jones, because Jamal Williams is gone, who is also stealing receptions and targets away from Aaron Jones. So the main competition for targets for Joe Mixon is gone. Not to mention the fact that defenses can't stack the box against Joe Mixon because they have to account for Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd. They have all that going on. So there's a lot of good things for Joe Mixon in a season where his August ADP is actually the cheapest that it's been since 2018, because like I said, there is a lot of Joe Mixon fatigue out there. If he disappoints again, I think that the fantasy community will just be kind of done with him. I mean, he'll be 26 years old next year. He has major outs in his contract that the Bengals actually decide to move on from him in 2022 or even beyond. There are more exciting players behind him in redraft ADP as well currently that could pass him next year. Guys like J.K. Dobbins, DeAndre Swift, Travis Etienne, Javonte Williams, not to mention if any 2022 rookies come into the fold as well and start entering that conversation with Joe Mixon, just because it's just another year where Mixon is kind of underperformed or not really lived up to expectations, was just kind of solid and average, but didn't really do much for you on a weekly basis to help you win in your fantasy leagues. So I think that's why this is a big time make or break season for Joe Mixon for both his NFL and potential fantasy value as well. The second player I have on this list is Philadelphia Eagles running back Miles Sanders. And similar to Joe Mixon, there is Miles Sanders, fatigue out there as well. Another player who has had high expectations, but those have yet to come into fruition at all, basically, over the past 2 years. Sanders is entering the third year of his career in this league after a promising RB15 rookie season, but then a very disappointing RB23 sophomore slump in 2020. There is fatigue out there as well for Sanders. Like I said, I mean, he's basically being drafted as one of the last quote-unquote workhorses in the running back position among starting running backs in redraft and dynasty leagues. Like Mixon, Sanders is also very boom bust as well, having, like I said, the third worst percentage of games outside the top 24, which was just worse than Joe Mixon, like I mentioned. But he also has a lower ceiling than Joe Mixon, with only 32% of games inside the top 12, which is very similar to other guys like David Montgomery and Kenyon Drake. So not that great of company for guys that we had massive expectations for with Miles Sanders. And like I said, I called him a quote-unquote workhorse because that has been the expectation, that he would eventually become a workhorse, maybe not a true 3-down guy like Christian McCaffrey or Saquon Barkley, but at least have, upwards of 250 plus touches in a single season. But that has never really been able to fully come into fruition. He's never been able to fully take the reins in Philadelphia, either by design, injury, or him just not being able to do it. Philadelphia Eagles beat reporter Elliot Shore-Parks actually commented a few days ago about the number of touches that both Sanders and Boston Scott have received at practice, with his expectation that they end up splitting touches all season, with Boston Scott acting primarily as the main pass-catching running back, which makes sense because Miles Sanders actually was awful in the receiving game last year. He was absolutely terrible when in 2020 in the passing game. And I mean, that also can be seen with the Philadelphia Eagles drafting Kenneth Gainwell in the 5th round as well, another fantastic pass-catching running back that they were able to draft and grab in the 5th round of this 2021 class. So you can see that there is legit concern for Miles Sanders entering the 2021 season from both a fantasy perspective, and I would also argue an NFL perspective as well, because honestly, if Sanders doesn't have some sort of breakout this year, to me, it would not be that surprising if the Philadelphia Eagles move on entirely after the 2022 season, after his rookie deal has expired in their 4th year. So now might actually be the best time to get out and cut bait with Miles Sanders if you have him in Dynasty, or maybe just avoid him entirely in redraft leagues, because this could be a major make or break season for Miles Sanders, and I don't know if I want to be on board that train when it leaves the station. And the final player I want to mention on here, and honestly, I even debated putting this player in this video, but I guess I have to include Steelers wide receiver Juju Smith-Schuster as having a make or break season for 2021. Because he does have a very negative connotation and association with his name in the fantasy community. He's being taken as the wide receiver 26 in Dynasty, the wide receiver 34 in redraft, which I think both are kind of crazy to me, given that his past history has been pretty solid and to elite, outside of really one really bad season. Honestly, the biggest problem with Juju Smith-Schuster is, again, just like Mixon and Sanders, is fatigue. He had that monstrous 111, 1,407 touchdown season back in 2018 in his second year with Antonio Brown. Antonio Brown did his thing and he left. He wasn't on the Steelers anymore. So then we were valuing him as a top 3 dynasty wide receiver, if not the wide receiver 1 overall. And in redraft leagues that year, he was valued as a top 5 wide receiver for 2019. However, 2019, he had that injury-riddled season, played almost entirely with Mason Rudolph because Big Ben got hurt. However, last year, though, he was the wide receiver 16. He had almost 100 receptions, had 9 receiving touchdowns on 128 targets, and was a top 10 wide receiver from week 7 on. But people want to make a big deal about his ADOT, his yards per reception, yada, 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 whatever. But I mean, that's what he was last year. He was the main slot guy. He was used as Ben's go-to on short passes because Ben is old. He doesn't want to get hit. The offensive line sucks. He's actually one of the fastest quarterbacks in getting the ball out of his hands from snap to throw. So, I mean, it just kind of so much happened that Juju Smith-Schuster was the guy that Ben was going to target, and that's why his ADOT and yards per reception were so low compared to Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool, even though Juju Smith-Schuster was still really good for fantasy. Like I said, the wide receiver 16 last year. And a lot of people want to compare Juju to Deontay Johnson. Obviously, he's not Chase Claypool, and what Chase Claypool can bring to the table is a lot different than Juju Smith-Schuster. But Juju Smith-Schuster actually has a higher yards per target than Deontay Johnson in each of the past 2 years. So he's been more efficient with the targets that he's received than Deontay Johnson, even though people want to say that Deontay Johnson has looked better than Juju Smith-Schuster over the past 2 years. He's just been targeted more, but Juju has been just as efficient, if not more efficient, with his targets than Deontay Johnson. To be honest, Juju's career so far reminds me a lot of Allen Robinson. Robinson also had a monstrous second season. He had that disappointing third season with the Jacksonville Jaguars and Blake Bortles. A-Rob then tore his ACL in year 4. That didn't happen to Juju, but that's what happened to A-Rob. He eventually then went on to a new team, to Chicago, and found big time success with the Chicago Bears, especially over the last 2 years. And I think that's a pretty similar path for Juju Smith-Schuster. And I'm not saying that Juju is Allen Robinson or some hidden or misused, alpha wide receiver. That's not Juju Smith-Schuster. What I'm saying is that I think a change of scenery for Juju could be really, really good for him and really escape the Pittsburgh Steelers, escape the impending retirement from Big Ben, become more of the certified and established wide receiver 2 on his own team. And because he's a free agent in 2022, he can absolutely do that and go and pick his team, pick his quarterback, pick the situation that he can play in, and actually thrive as a great wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 1B again, like he was with Antonio Brown, in a new situation with a new team. The reason I had him as a make or break season in 2021 is because it's basically down to what his production is this year for his future value in both the NFL and for fantasy football. If he's really good again, not even the 1400 season, but what he did kind of similarly last year where he's around a 1,000 yard receiver, if that's what we get from him in 2021, then he should get a good free agency contract, and fantasy football and the community should follow suit with that, with his new situation on a new team. However, if he is, potentially maybe passed up by Chase Claypool, much more the wide receiver 3 because he's a main slot guy for the Pittsburgh Steelers in 2021, has an underperforming season, disappointing a little bit, then he could potentially, get a really bad free agency contract. And then people in the industry just start taking Juju Smith-Schuster victory laps because they knew that he couldn't make it or couldn't be a good fantasy option for you, or not really that good of an NFL receiver. So that is why I picked Juju as a make or break type of season, along with Miles Sanders and Joe Mixon entering the 2021 season. If you'd like to watch a video of me breaking down why I may not be into Justin Herbert at his current ADP entering 2021, you can click right up here. And with that all being said, guys, thank you all so much for watching, and we'll catch y'all later.